Good morning, everybody. The webinar will begin very shortly. We're just going to wait a few moments to let everybody join the call and then we'll begin. Okay, good morning, everybody. I see we've still got people joining our call, but we'll begin very slowly. So just to say a big welcome to today's webinar. This is all about how government works. I'm Siobhan Bonita. I'm a former UK civil servant and really pleased to be chairing today's webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum. This is the second of our series on how government works. And last month, we covered kind of how Whitehall is organised. We looked at civil servants and what civil servants do, what their roles and responsibilities are, where power lies. You can see all of that. It's still linked on our website if you want to catch up with our first webinar. But today we're going to be looking at more at the kind of governance, regulation and culture in Whitehall and Westminster and a little bit beyond. And we're going to be covering things like the Civil Service Code, the Commission. We're going to be looking at the Ministerial Code. I think a lot of these things we hear a lot about in the news, especially when there are concerns that these codes are being breached. We're going to look at the role of some of the independent scrutiny bodies and some of the parliamentary bodies that scrutinise the way things are done. And then something that might, I think, be of particular interest to you in our audience today, we're going to be looking at the rules and kind of legislation processes around public procurement. I've got two brilliant colleagues with me here today who I'll introduce in a moment, and they're going to kind of run through some of those areas that we're looking at today. I'm going to pose some questions to them so that they can give me the answers and the overview of some of those issues. But as always, we'd like this to be very much a conversation with you, our audience. So you should see on your screen somewhere, whichever device you are using, there'll be a Q&A button. At any point, please do use that Q&A button to message in your questions, and we can make this like a discussion, so I can kind of interrupt the flow and take the questions as we go through. And we will also make sure there's a lot of time for questions at the end. So we don't want you to leave thinking that you had a question that didn't get answered today. So please do send in your questions. So the two great colleagues that I have with me here today, we've got James Humphreys, who is Global Government Forum's Associate Policy Trainer. And he was previously Head of Corporate Communications in the Prime Minister's office, from where he launched the first mobile app for government. He was also a visiting professor at City University London and launched a Master's in Political Communications for Kingston University. And he spent 2 years as an environmental attaché in Brussels, so has really great experience of kind of the policy landscape, but also how the real heart of government works. And we've also got with us here today Richard Johnston, who is Executive Editor at Global Government Forum. And Richard helps to produce the editorial analysis and insight for GGF. And before joining GGF, he spent nearly 5 years at the UK-based Civil Service World publication, and he's worked in public policy journalism all throughout his professional career. So really does, again, know all of this stuff. So we've got lots to get through. So really, I'm going to start by asking Richard, as we mentioned before, this is something I think we hear a lot about in the news. Can you just tell us, Richard, in terms of how civil servants are supposed to work and the rules they're supposed to follow, what exactly is the Civil Service Code?
Thank you, Siobhan, and good morning, everybody. So the Civil Service Code is the kind of rule book that's meant to encapsulate the values of the civil service and how civil servants should work and set the standards that are expected of them in a way that can be used in kind of the day-to-day working life of government. So to take maybe one step back first. What are the civil service values? In the UK, there are four core values for the civil service. They are integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality. To break those down, integrity means putting the obligations of public service above your own personal interests. Honesty means being truthful and open. Objectivity means basing your advice and decisions on rigorous analysis of evidence. And impartiality means acting solely according to the merits of the case and serving equally well governments of different political persuasions. And those core values are set out to ensure that civil service can indeed meet their key mission of providing support to the government of the day. And we have seen, obviously, in the UK in recent months, a change of government. The vast majority of civil servants will serve both governments, and civil servants pride themselves on being able to serve governments of different political stripes equally well. There's famous stories of civil servants changing the colour of their tie as the new Prime Minister comes through the door of number 10. So that is a key civil service skill. So that's the kind of the key values. The civil service works, as I said, with government, and civil servants are accountable to ministers, who are then in turn accountable to Parliament. So that's how accountability works in kind of broad strokes, and we'll get into that a little bit. So the code then itself it sets the standards of behaviour that are expected in order to meet these values. Yeah. It sets out standards under each of these values. And they're both kind of positive things that civil servants must do, and negative things that they cannot do. Another principle is that civil servants are appointed on merit, on the basis of fair and open competition. And once they are appointed, they must be made aware of the code by their department. And if civil servants have any concerns that they are being asked to act in a way that conflicts with the code, then they are required to raise it in the first instance with either their line manager or a nominated officer in their department who has responsibility to advise staff on the code. And then if they do not consider a reasonable response, they can raise the matter higher up with the Civil Service Commission, who are kind of the guardians of the code itself.
So is that the job of the Civil Service Commissioners? Because again, people might have heard about the Civil Service Commissioners, and is their function then to kind of uphold the Civil Service Code? Is that what they're there to do?
So the Commission has kind of two broad roles. One is to kind of promote those values of the civil service, kind of writ large, and a second role, which is probably what they do more of on a day-to-day basis, which is safeguarding those recruitment principles to ensure appointments are made on merit, fair and open competition. The Commission, or commissioners, civil service commissioners, have existed since 1855, which was after the landmark Northcote Trevelyan report that some of the more nerdy viewers of our webinar today might have heard of, that established basically these civil service values, but it was placed on a statutory basis in 2010, so it has now a statutory footing. And the commissioners kind of oversee recruitment principles that are produced by the Commission and then shared with departments. For lower level jobs, those principles are applied by the departments themselves, although the Commission will kind of scrutinise on a regular basis how well departments are meeting those principles. And then for some higher level appointments into the senior civil service, those recruitment panels will include a civil service commissioner. There are 14 of those who will sit on those various panels. So the Civil Service Commission is something you hear an awful lot about sometimes, and there are questions sometimes raised about the speed of civil service recruitment, if it has to go through all these kind of impartiality levers. There's a video on the Civil Service Commission website from the former kind of head commissioner, Ian Watmore, who says that the aim of the Commission is to they want departments to be able to get the skills that they need to meet the challenges of the day. The
Right.
quote from Ian is, "We need to ensure departments can go and get the skills they need without compromising the fundamental principles of
Okay.
impartiality and independence."
Brilliant. Thanks, Richard. If anybody has any questions then about the Civil Service Code or potentially the way civil servants are recruited and maybe some issues around impartiality and can you be a member of a party, those kind of things, please do ping those questions across to us and we will get those answered. But I'm going to move on because I know we've got a lot to cover. And James, the Civil Service Code then obviously applies to civil servants, but do ministers have their own code? Because we certainly have heard a lot over the last few years, I think, about the ministerial code and whether ministers are breaching the code or not. So what happens when it comes to ministers and do they have their own code?
They do, and it has many similarities. So a lot of the same, if you like, expectations would come up, and these are sometimes described as expectations that come from a different era in which there were assumptions about how people, and to use the terminology of the time, it's often said chaps. You know, how would people be expected to behave in their everyday life, and then they would be bringing that those issues about integrity and honesty, public service. And there is something we will come on to, I'm sure, which is the notion that basic expectations on how good chaps should behave doesn't work anymore. That has been demonstrated not to be. So we now have something a bit more formal. But the ministerial code, though admirable in many ways, does have a couple of issues, which again we might come on to, about who is administering it. So if we think about the Civil Service Commission, you could imagine if you wanted to bypass it, you would make sure that the people appointed to run the commission were going to run it your way. With the ministerial code, it's even more clear that that is a potential, because the person who sits at the top of the interpretation of that is a politician.
Okay, so just to be clear for the people that are listening, the ministerial code, ultimately, it's the Prime Minister, is that right, who decides
Exactly, yes.
if the code has been breached or not?
Yes.
So one of the issues I think that we saw under the last administration is if the Prime Minister themselves is being investigated under the code, that then becomes a little bit problematic.
It does, but it's also problematic, and I think it's worth saying it's not to, if you like, to take sides on this. So a lot of the time when the ministerial code is potentially going to be applied, these are on perhaps situations people haven't thought of before, and they are going to be you know, there's often a case to be made for the actions, even if others might look at it and say this definitely would breach the code. And I think we've seen that particularly on both sides with some of the responses to COVID. So that's a question where somebody might say, look, I needed to get something done. I knew somebody who I thought could get the job done. It was a national emergency. Somebody else might look at it and go, yes, but the people that you knew would get the job done and you got in to do the job have gained from that. And one of the key principles of the ministerial code is that you make sure, back to objectivity, that you don't do your decision-making role as a minister in a way that favours people you might know, and perhaps this is more where the trouble can arise. People who may then not necessarily hand you a bundle of £20 notes and a brown envelope, but may be helpful to you or your political party in the future. And that is often where some of these things can look bad. They may not have been intentional. So there is an element of judgment and what's the fair way of interpreting it. But yes, that all goes up fundamentally or finally to the Prime Minister
and
to
we'll
decide.
probably, when we come on to procurement rules at the end of this section, we'll probably come back to the issues around COVID maybe and how that was. So in the code, Richard said in the Civil Service Code, they have their 4 principles, the values, the civil service values: objectivity, impartiality, integrity, and honesty. And I think in the ministerial code, they have to follow the 7 principles of public life. Is that right? So the Nolan principles, they're called, of public life.
Yes, absolutely. So there are some differences. I think the differences are not dramatic. So the Nolan principles talk a bit more about leadership, and they're perhaps a bit more explicit about accountability. I think that is one of the very difficult things for ministers, is accountability and transparency is sort of open book. Anyone can come in, look at anything I'm doing. Obviously, they will feel, some of the people who want to come in and have a look at that, opposition MPs, journalist, perhaps from a non-sympathetic news organisation. It would be naive to be too transparent and too open and have too much accountability. So again, it's one of those grey areas where you can see why people would take the decisions they do, even if you disagree with them. And I think, yes, I'd probably pick out accountability as one of the interesting differences in that group.
So I've got here, I've written them down because I must admit I can't remember the 7 principles in the same way I can remember the 4 civil service values. So there's selflessness, integrity, objectivity, leadership, accountability, openness, and honesty. And in the same way Richard was saying, if you have a concern as a civil servant about the code, whether you know somebody who might not be following the code, or you think an appointment has been done incorrectly or something, you go to the commissioners. When it comes to the ministerial code, you go to the independent ethics advisor, is that right? But that advisor then reports to the Prime Minister. So that's where this can become a bit problematic.
It can, and I think where we also see it it's another classic and very British distinction between what is written down on a piece of paper as how it works and how it works. So in my experience, I would not be thinking of a lot of examples of where a minister getting on with running their department, making their decisions, thinks, I know what, I really need to go and talk to the ethics advisor who works for the Prime Minister. That is not really what they would be thinking of doing. The ethics advisor plays a useful role, but it can often be, if you like, their second function, which is advising the Prime Minister. How does this particular set of circumstances that's now come to the Prime Minister's attention, how does it fit within the code? And if there was some sort of criticism or sanction of a minister, what would be the appropriate sanction? So I think day-to-day ministers feel they can make these calls and just get on with it. They wouldn't be a sort of a constant process of going to the advisor.
Great, thanks. So again, if you have any questions about the ministerial code or the civil service code, please do ping them over and we will try and answer those. But James, I want to stick with you now because there are obviously the codes that kind of cover the individual behaviours of people, but also we do hear as well about kind of the scrutiny of actions and policies and decisions that are taken at the departmental level, and those are done by kind of what we call the parliamentary committees. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the committees that we have in Parliament and what their functions are?
Yeah, so probably start with the select committees. So the idea here, it dates back now quite a long time, was that if you have a government which will have a majority in Parliament, how is that scrutinised when Parliament has, in theory at least, the ultimate power? And so the idea was you'd put together these committees of people who would be backbench MPs. So they're not either ministers and they're not opposition spokespeople. And their job is to go through the detail and hold ministers to account, hold the executive to account. They have usually a small but very able cadre of officials who give them support, and also informal advisors. So if you had a select committee, for example, on the environment, there'd be a clerk to the committee who would know that world, would know where to go to pull in more expertise, and there would be people who, if they were investigating a particular topic, they might say, well, we'll get in some expertise on that. And it can either be in an advisory role, if you like, behind the scenes, so they would be writing briefing papers for the members of that committee, or it can be that they're asked to come and give evidence. So this is then on the record. It's almost always now filmed. The public, if you can get a seat, you can go and watch it. And this is where the committee, aiming to act in a non-partisan way, doesn't always manage it, but it's trying to say, no, we're not just going to sit here as Labour, Lib Dem, whoever. We're going to sit here as people who have a duty to Parliament to hold the executive to account. And so and it does happen. You will get a Labour or Conservative minister will get hostile questioning or probing questioning from their, quotes, own side. So the committees are, potentially, it does depend on the membership, potentially very, very powerful and effective tools for keeping the executive to account and helping with issues like transparency. So that the reports they publish when they've investigated a particular topic, had a set of hearings, often very, very well researched, very but also very focused on usually on the issues that matter.
And you said they're backbench MPs. So if for example, you've been a member of a committee and then you get a promotion into a ministerial post, do you have to leave that committee?
Yes, you wouldn't be able to do both roles. And some MPs, and often some of the most effective MPs who end up perhaps with more of the admiration of the British public, are the ones who choose sort of select committees and the equivalents as their kind of contribution in Parliament, the main thing that they do. They don't aim to be MPs. Sometimes they will have been, aim to be ministers. Sometimes they will have been a minister, and that can be very useful experience because if you like, they're poacher turned gamekeeper. But it's a sort of separate route. But when we think of some of the people who have taken up this role, they have made a big difference down the track. So these are big, important parts, and obviously there's a lot of competition to get onto them, to serve on them.
Okay.
And again, that is one of the again slightly obscure processes whereby membership is agreed through a sort of a consultation process between the parties that's trying to reflect the fact that Parliament expects there to be not place people but actual MPs who are going to take it seriously and are going to be prepared to ask difficult questions.
Okay. And my understanding is most of these select committees, so each department has its own kind of select committee that will scrutinise the work of that department. But there are also a couple like the PAC, so the Public Affairs Committee, Accounts Committee, and the Environmental Audit, I think is the other one. And they cut across departments, is that? And they're the ones where, in particular, as you said, that people can kind of make a name for themselves really by chairing those committees.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, whether it's something, as you say, departmental led like defence, or whether it's particularly the PAC, because they can go anywhere, ask anyone to come and give evidence, and also have the happy thing that it's about money. So it also feels like they've got a real grip on the levers with that. Yes, so you definitely can build a profile, build a career, but it's not necessarily that that's all that the MPs chairing these committees are trying to do. But I think it means that it's given Parliament, which otherwise could become very hollowed out. It would be the cliche. You've got ministers, you've got the opposition front bench, and then you've got voting fodder. It means that people in those roles can really put something back in.
And when it comes to the House of Lords, do they also have committees? How do those function?
They do, and they tend not to try, as always with the Lords, they're conscious that they are not elected. Therefore, the prospect of then having House of Lords committee was also writing reports on defence and gathering in the same witnesses and grilling the same ministers. So it tends to be, they would take a theme like technology. Then again, that's something where if you're in the Lords, you might think, well, this is going to add a different take. And in that context, Parliament is one of these things that can be quite flexible, and in theory, you can change the composition of committees. So you will see that as a new department is formed, quite quickly Parliament catches up, and there will then be a select committee that will be shadowing it.
Right. Thanks, James. So any questions you have on committees, select committees, House of Lords, House of Commons, how they function, are they always MPs, all those kind of questions, just message them in to us. I want to move on though, because the select committees and the parliamentary committees aren't the only way of kind of scrutinizing things. So Richard, we also have bodies like that are more independent, that are watchdogs, that aren't the membership isn't MP. So can you give us a flavour of some of those? I mean, the things that spring to mind, you've got a picture there come up on the screen of the NAO, but there are others. Can you tell us what some of these other bodies are, and why do we need those if we already have these committees in Parliament?
Yes, thanks, Siobhan. There's a kind of panoply of kind of official watchdogs of government. The National Audit Office is probably the most prominent, but there's also ones like the Office for Budget Responsibility that we heard a lot about during Liz Truss's short-lived premiership, and the Office for National Statistics slightly comes into this, although that's a slightly different organisation. And they all have important roles in providing kind of independent expert scrutiny of some of the work that government does. The NAO is probably the biggest one. It has two main functions. It audits the accounts of all government departments and indeed all bodies whose funding is approved by Parliament, because the National Audit Office is a creature of Parliament, that is to whom it is accountable, and it's NAO reports that lead to a lot of the Public Accounts Committee hearings. There's a direct link between a National Audit Office report and then a PAC hearing. And the NAO also conducts value for money audits of the effectiveness of various government policies. So it's often in the headlines when it finds that policies haven't been value for money, but it's also increasingly now trying to do kind of lesson learned reports where it's not just critical, it's also kind of looking at how to avoid the problems. And they've done some recently around infrastructure, asset management, digital transformation, reducing fraud and error, things like that. Okay. The NAO has been about since, in its current guise, since 1983, and before that it existed as a body within government much longer. The OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is a much more recent creation. It was created in 2010 to provide independent analysis of UK public finances. It was created as a kind of response to concerns mainly from the Conservatives that Treasury analysis was sometimes not willfully partisan, but kind of caught up in political cycles, and that the OBR would provide independent analysis. Those have kind of grown in importance, again, as a response to a policy choice, as governments constrain themselves through fiscal rules that say how much they can borrow and spend on both revenue spending and capital spending. How the OBR projects the economy to grow is essentially the thing that decides how much headroom governments have on these fiscal rules. And that has made the OBR, to some extent, I think, kind of a bit unwillingly, into a very important political organisation. All the OBR wants to do is provide the best forecast that it possibly can. If a government then decides that what it can spend is a function of those OBR projections, then it becomes a very kind of important political element. We saw during the budget that wasn't quite a budget that Kwasi Kwarteng produced during Liz Truss's premiership, the importance of the OBR analysis. They made that fiscal statement without an OBR analysis, and that kind of led to a lot of people kind of questioning it, and that there was then the problems with increasing government borrowing rates, and that led to Liz Truss's departure eventually. Just quickly on the Office for National Statistics, it has a similar role in terms of it produces official national government statistics. It is part of the UK Statistics Authority, which the UK Statistics Authority includes the ONS, which is the bit that produces the stats, and then there is also the Office for Statistical Regulation, which is the bit, they were split fairly recently. The Office for Statistical Regulation is the bit that assesses the stats that government departments themselves produce to check that they meet national statistical standards, and it's often them, the Office for Statistical Regulation, that respond to questions about how departments use data. So those are kind of, I would say, the three biggest ones. There are loads of others. The Commission for Aid Impact, for example, is an important one. I think that doesn't quite get the profile it deserves, analysing the importance of international aid spending, which is a very important part of what government does. But those are the kind of the headliners, I think you'd say.
And so these bodies are obviously independent, more independent, I think, than the other committees that we've talked about. As you say, expert bodies providing independent scrutiny. But is there any, like in terms of who works for these bodies, are they civil servants? Who are the people? What's the status of the people that would work for the NAO, for example? Are they civil servants on secondment? How does that work?
They will be full-time employees of the NAO. This is one of the areas where you kind of end up dancing a little bit on the head of a pin. I
Yeah.
think they will be categorized as public servants rather than civil servants, in the same way that employees at the
Okay.
Bank of England aren't technically
Right.
civil servants and aren't governed by the Civil Service Code to the same degree, but they will have due regard to a lot of the factors that we've already discussed. But yeah, there are policies in place in order to ensure that these bodies are independent and are kind of aside from government. And yeah, so they won't directly be civil servants. They'll be
No.
a slightly different employment category usually.
No.
The exception being, I think the ONS. I think the ONS are civil servants still.
Okay.
But,
And I guess there's inevitably, because there'll be a certain skill set that will match. So there might be some, you might be on secondment from the civil service, for example. But we do have a question that's come in from Michael Stoll. I really like this question because I think it reflects the frustration that a lot of people will be feeling up and down the country at the moment on quite a lot of these regulatory bodies. So Michael has said, what happens to the often substantial funding that regulatory bodies recover through fines, for example, Ofwat, and why does this never seem to benefit the consumer? And I think the same could be said, I think, for the energy regulators. I think they've all been in the news again this morning with the announcement that energy prices are going to go up again by 10%. So, James or Richard, do you know what happens to the money that the regulatory bodies recover through fines? And why don't we ever see that going back to the consumer? I mean, my initial response to this is they probably don't recover enough anyway in the first place. But James, over to you. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, perhaps two. I mean, as a general principle, the money goes into the Treasury, and the Treasury has a view that it basically hates allocating money coming in to a particular task, which it uses the technical term hypothecation. It really doesn't like that because it means the Treasury is not giving ministers advice about where the money should go, and it all goes into one pot. It gets very, as they would say, very messy. So there are very few examples of where money coming in, and this applies to taxation as well. There are a few examples. So there is a levy on the use of landfill. That goes into a pot that then goes for environmental improvement. But these are really rare. So the basic principle is on fines. These are court fines. You speeding fine. Anything goes into the pot, and then there's a separate process for allocating it. With, as always in Britain, a few exceptions.
Thanks, James. Richard, did you want to add anything to that?
That's exactly right, and I think that point about hypothecation, slightly aside from our conversation today, but it's always a very good one. It comes up a lot in national insurance and things like that. People think that national insurance contributions are creating a pension pot for them when they retire. They're very much not. They are going into a pot out of which money will be drawn to pay current pensioners, but amongst many other things. So yeah, it's an important point to remember.
Thanks. We've got another question coming in. Rebecca Rendell has said, do we need an independent health agency for government scrutiny? The UK Health Security Agency presumably should fulfill this role, but it is part of the Department of Health, so cannot be fully independent. Richard, I'm going to ask you, I mean, there are various bodies that look at parts of the national health system, aren't there? But anything you would like to say to Rebecca on her question?
Yeah, there are bodies that do the regulatory functions of the health system. It probably, to get to the number of Rebecca's question, they probably don't quite all join up. The Care Quality Commission is the one that's the major regulator of health and social care services. There's also the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which makes recommendations in terms of effectiveness of treatment. And yeah, Rebecca's question alludes to the creation of the UK Health Security Agency, which was created kind of post-COVID, bringing together a lot of different things. But it is a creature of government. It is led by Jenny Harris, who is a civil servant. So it is kind of, I think, brings in experts to provide a degree of independent challenge. But yes, the point in the question is well made, that it is a creature of government. The health sector is so big in the UK, that kind of systemic analysis is a massive job. I would say that of the bodies we've discussed today, the NAO will do a substantial amount of scrutiny of the kind of institutions, as it were, the institutions of government that are involved in healthcare delivery. But perhaps, as so often in these kind of conversations, there is scope for a degree of better joining up of the different inspections that already take place.
Yeah, thanks. Richard, James, sorry, did you want to add anything on Rebecca's point?
No, I think it's a very good point, and I think the regulators themselves, and I should probably declare an interest because I've worked for several of these bodies at different times. I mean, they are aware of it, and everyone I think in healthcare provision is really conscious. It can appear to be a very fragmented landscape, and I think it's again one of these things where we're not only looking, if you like, at government, we're also looking at other, such as the professional bodies. The Royal College of GPs, you've then got regulatory bodies such as professional bodies. It's enormously complicated. And it's noticeable that the Department of Health of, say, 20 or 30 years ago, it's now much, much smaller and has much less capacity to do policy. There are pluses and minuses about that, because it means that a lot of the policy is now done in the NHS. So NHS England would do a lot of policy. And you get more people who have actually worked on the front line involved in policy. So you'll have now on a policy review in health, you will have people who are 3 days a week working as a physio and then 2 days a week working on a report. And that can bring some real benefits. But again, it's a very complicated and arguably quite messy. But equally, if you try and reform it, the risk is you'll create some more problems elsewhere. So I don't think there's a simple solution.
Well, this does lead on to the next question, which is coming from Simon. Thanks, Simon, Gideon, for your question, which is who decides on the scope of activity of regulators? And in light of the various problematic issues in regulated sectors, one, do the regulators need to be more empowered or obliged to take stronger action when things go wrong? But also, who is kind of scrutinizing the regulators as well to make sure they're doing their job properly? Richard or James, do you want to come in? I know we do want to get onto procurement, I think a lot of people, but does anybody want to come in on Simon's question?
I'm happy to, but I'm sure Richard will have plenty to say as well, perhaps. Who regulates the regulators is a big issue. In theory, it's back up to ministers and to Parliament. So most regulators are you might say arm's length. They are not operationally managed by ministers, but they are working to a programme that is set by a department and essentially then set by government. But they're also working within a legal framework which gives them a separate set of responsibilities. So then that's back to Parliament. And again, in pragmatic terms, it is a challenge for regulators, because if they are too regulatory, then they can be it can go badly for them. So there are examples. I mean, famously, the National Rivers Authority, going back 20 years or more, was a very, very effective regulator. And when it was merged with other bodies to create the Environment Agency, there was a view it was being punished for having been too good. So there can be an issue in which regulators are slightly, there's a sort of potentially a chilling effect. There's also a question about the resources. They can only operate on the resources they're given. And again, to be fair to the Environment Agency, their resources were cut on the bread and butter for a regulator, or, for example, sending somebody out in waders into a river with a glass they can vial, they can collect the water in and test it. So regulation is a tricky one. It's got some very good people working in it. But it can be, the relationship with government and with ministers is a very delicate one, and they don't always get it right.
Thanks. Richard, before you come in, if you've got anything to add, I want to add in Julie's question, because it's on the same issue that James had just said. Is there any principle of regulatory consistency across departments and regulators? I think this is the age-old question, is there consistency and a kind of joined-up approach across government? So is there a scientifically tested approach and approved by one department that could be recognised by all other departments in order to reduce red tape, for example? Richard, your thoughts on regulation and consistency? We could do, it sounds like we could do a whole webinar, I think, just on regulatory bodies. I'll make a note of that for next time.
We almost certainly could, and we're doing some interesting work looking at, for example, the regulation of artificial intelligence and where that is going to sit in the UK government. And the current approach is that the different regulatory bodies, who we've not even touched on here, the Competition and Markets Authority, for example, will regulate it in their specific sphere rather than creating a overall regulator for AI. And then you do get into a lot of the questions about the join up and where the kind of the creases are in that landscape. It's a very good question. I would say the closest thing we have to consistency is consistency of principle, which is about regulation having to be proportionate to the potential risks, and focusing often, this is often explicit in a lot of regulatory mandates, focusing on the consumer and on keeping prices down, as opposed to some of the other elements, and I think this is changing, some of the other elements that might be around kind of systemic health, for example. The only point I was going to make in addition to James's point was, yeah, it's really interesting that the things that regulators focus on. So we've seen and these are all decisions of Parliament. They're not. This is not me casting aspersions on regulators in any way. James is right. There's a lot of people, very good people, working very hard on it. But we've seen, for example, the example of Thames Water, which is now a very heavily indebted company. All the time that it was building up that debt, it was being regulated by Ofwat. So that the work it did, I don't think, in borrowing that money, I don't think was in breach of its licenses. It was because Ofwat was regulation primarily on price to the consumer, and Ofwat and Thames was creating enough revenue that it could service the debt in a way that kept prices low. But then there's a change in the economic environment, and that becomes more of a problem. So it's creating the right kind of ambit for a regulator is really difficult, and not something that is kind of permanent. But these being often relatively large institutions, keeping up with the changes that happen is something that's very difficult, particularly if their mandate is set by Parliament. That all slows down.
Yeah, thanks. It's quite complicated, I think, but I think, as you say, constantly needing review, I think. And very quickly, because I do want to get onto procurement, if all else fails, we also have, so we've talked about kind of parliamentary scrutiny and independent bodies, but if all else fails, of course, we also have our legal system, the court system as well. Richard, could you just tell us very briefly, the one thing we do hear about sometimes when it comes to decisions made by kind of public bodies is the possibility of a judicial review. People can ask for a judicial review. So in just a couple of minutes, I know it's quite hard, but could you tell us where that might be used and how that fits into this kind of accountability and scrutiny landscape?
Yes, more than happy to, although amongst all the caveats that we should be providing in this webinar today, I am not a lawyer, and this does not constitute legal advice. Just a very quick summary. So the decisions taken by public bodies in the UK, not just central government, but all public bodies, including the regulators we've talked about, the local government and police forces, can be subject to judicial review. A judicial review is not a review of the outcome of a decision or an action. It is a review of the process that was taken to make a decision, to check that the process was in line with all the requirements set out governing that body in legislation, and all the requirements for proper public consultation. It is really the primary interface between the courts and kind of and public policy. To give you an idea, quick idea of the scale of this, and I've borrowed these figures from the Institute for Government. But in 2018, to pick a year at random, there were 3,597 claims for judicial review that were lodged at the High Court. But of those 3,597, only 184, so 5%, proceeded to a full hearing.
Mhm.
Many reasons why it might not reach there. They were either refused permission, they didn't have the right standing to proceed the case, or they were withdrawn, or they were resolved out of court.
Interesting. So the key thing as well, as you said, is the review is not of the decision,
Yeah,
it's of the process, whether this was conducted, whether the legal process was conducted correctly.
yeah, exactly. The policy making process. And that, I think, is where there's quite a lot of criticism of judicial review from the right of politics usually, but I don't think exclusively, that the work of reviewing the process of how government works slows everything down. You know,
Right.
of all those cases I mentioned, we don't have this number at hand, but a lot government will have to have been involved in looking into a lot more than 184 of them.
Yeah.
Somewhere between 184 and 3,597, there will have been government lawyers
Yeah.
looking at the
Yeah.
process and making their case that this did not in fact meet
Yeah.
the threshold for review. So the last Conservative government did try to change how judicial review worked. And the main thing when I was looking around that it seems to have been enacted is what's called a suspended quashing order. So if a judicial review rules against government, hitherto that policy, whatever it was, would have been kind of null and void pretty much
Right.
immediately. A suspended quashing order is taking the idea that if there was a flaw in the process that's been identified in the judicial review, perhaps the department can go back and fix that bit rather
Right.
than having to go back to first principles. That's the
Right.
kind of thing that you could see kind of quickening this process. But it's a very interesting one to keep an eye on, I think.
Yeah.
Labour has made big play on planning reform and trying to speed up a lot of infrastructure delivery. We're expecting a new national planning policy statement at some point that is intended to, in Labour's words, slash red tape, a favourite phrase of people trying to do these things. We are not a nation short of national planning policy statements, and they do not always lead to quicker development. A lot of these things end up in judicial review, where the policy making process is kind of questioned, and it will be very interesting to see if the national plan, the new policy statement, doesn't quicken things, whether this is something that the government kind of alights on. I'm not saying that based on any insight, but as you kind of work down the decision tree of kind of if you're trying to make planning happen quicker, this might be an area where you look at whether all these cases should be.
And Anushka has come in and said, shouldn't a decision also be checked against constitutional values or other overriding values? But James or Richard, I guess that's exactly what would be happening during the judicial review, isn't it? When they're checking that all of those things that should have been done have been done.
Yes. So, for example, through the implementation of the European Convention on Human Rights, you have a right to property. So, if a government takes away your enjoyment of your property, you have a potential claim to say that there was not a sufficient justification and that the decision to do so might be unreasonable. So, for example, this case a couple of years ago when the government basically banned the possession of ivory. We might all go, great, that's going to save some elephants. But one of the effects of that was if you had a 17th century harpsichord with ivory keys, it became worthless.
Right.
You could give it to a museum, but you couldn't sell it. There was even a question about whether your children could inherit it. So that was the subject of a judicial review. And I think one of the things about judicial reviews, they're always seen in government as negative, which I think is a real shame, because other bits of government and perhaps learning from the private sector see complaints as a positive. You can learn from them. But in that case, the DEFRA, the department responsible, the policy went through, the Act of Parliament and its implementation was allowed. But the judge did comment on the poor quality of some of the evidence that was used in the decision making. So I think sometimes what judicial review can do is reveal problems in the way government handles things, which shouldn't be there. And sometimes, even if the judicial review fails, it's not bad if the claim is meant. But to go back to the question, yes, there are some fundamental principles. If there aren't, you don't really have the ability to bring a case in the first place. And
Yeah.
the classic one is the government being unreasonable in the way that it acted? You know, has it not consulted people properly? Has it not looked at people's fundamental rights? So yeah, that
Yeah.
absolutely is central to the JR process.
Yeah. And we could have a whole other webinar on what are our constitutional values as well, couldn't we? Given that we don't have anything written down. But yeah, Richard, and then James, I'm going to come to both of you on this because I think procurement is it's the one issue that we get asked about the most, I think, especially when we're talking to a lot of, say, potential suppliers to government. So, Richard, I'm going to ask you first, just to cover off a little bit about when it comes to public procurement, what are the kind of rules around public procurement? So what are the basics around what government and suppliers are considering? And then James, I might come to you for your wealth of experience to give a bit of colour around this on some of the things that you've experienced when it comes to issues around procurement from your time at the centre of government. So Richard, start with you, the kind of process overview and what people have to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Siobhan, and deep breath rather, because this is something that is can be rather complex. I think UK government procurement rules are complicated, and they're kind of complicated for a reason. They're governed by lots of different pieces of legislation, of regulation, and policy, and it can be difficult to get your head around for your bit of the public sector if you're trying to bid for work. But the starting point, as set out by the government, is that the overriding procurement policy requirement is that all public procurement must be based on value for money, defined as the best mix of quality and effectiveness for the least outlay over the period of use of the goods or services bought. So that's the overriding principle, which is based on value for money. The kind of next principle down is that should be achieved through a competition unless there are compelling reasons to the contrary. So what government wants to buy should be made publicly available so that the widest range of people can bid for it. And we have Contract Finder for the UK government that is intended to do that. Mm-hmm. And then kind of linked to our previous discussion, public sector procurement is subject to a legal framework that some procurement decisions can sometimes be challenged. And there's then that's a kind of overarching principle, and then you get into kind of some policy bits that are laid on top of that. One kind of major policy objective that government has added into procurement over the last decade or so is social value, which is the requirement in the pre-procurement stage that the procurement body in government consider how their procurement can be run in such a way as to improve the social, environmental, and economic well-being of the area where the contract is being applied. So there's now consideration of things like impact on employment, getting people from different communities into work, on the environmental impact, and things like that. Different procurement competitions tend to give different weighting to those different elements, depending on the kind of individual departmental policy for procurement. But I would say that the kind of question of value for money often is the sort of trump card. Of course, value for money can include things like social value, but how those are weighted in the competitions kind of varies from example to example. And as I said, the principle is that these things are awarded through competition, but there's some kind of high-profile examples to the contrary. We saw during the pandemic, for example, procurement rules were relaxed as government sought to procure a lot of things at pace. But we've seen that this kind of has led to contracts being awarded to some people who were not able to fulfill them, and the new government has announced the appointment of a commissioner to review a lot of the contracts to see if there is money to be claimed back. So it's an interesting example. We've touched on it a few of them. It
Yeah.
feels like a relatively mundane bit of policy, albeit very complex, but it's one of these things that can kind of quickly come to the fore and
Yeah.
kind of dominate government life for a little bit if it goes wrong or if there's
Yeah.
kind of exceptional circumstances.
Thanks, Richard. So, James, I'm going to come to you. So, Richard set out the overview there, and it sounds in theory like it should be quite straightforward. So, everything should be open to competition, it should be fair and equal access to everybody. As Richard said, increasingly, government are asking for evidence of other things like your environmental impact, how it's going to help them reach their net zero targets, for example. So, all pretty straightforward. However, we hear all the time from suppliers how difficult it is to do business with government and that the procurement process doesn't necessarily do what it says on the tin. So from your experience, what are the issues? What did you experience when you were in government? And where do you think the kind of sticking points are in this process?
Yeah, of course. Well, I think it is fair to perhaps to start by saying I think almost everyone involved in this process has good intentions. And so both having worked in government, but also done procurement, and also a couple of years chaired a trade body, of people who were doing procurement. So having seen it from different sides of the hill, if you're in government, you've got a task to do, and you think, well, there are these people outside who can help us do it, and you then often it's policy people then turning to procurement specialists, and you go, well, we are inheriting the same framework as everyone else. So as a policy official, you often might be going, well, I wouldn't do it that way, but I can see why there are rules. So not everyone has discretion or autonomy in the process, even the people who are doing the buying. And there's also an element of I'd always stress this, that there's a risk aversion is built into the system. So as the old adage was, no one got fired for buying IBM back in the day when IBM was a big provider in IT. And then the same, if you're in government and something goes wrong and somebody turned, your deputy director general or whatever turned to you and said, what on earth did you do running that procurement? It's all gone pear-shaped. You can turn around and go, well, we appointed these people, and if they've got a big name in that field, I won't quote any of that, would be unfair. But if you had a big name in that field, everyone's going to go, well, fair enough. We can see why they got it. Whereas if it's a bunch of people you've never heard of, well, maybe you were taking a bit of a risk, and so there is a bit of a pressure to go with the people go with them, and I think that's why people are sometimes mystified in defence procurement, where IT procurement, where companies who have a checkered history of delivering against the contracted undertakings get reappointed. And it's partly there aren't always that many players, and it's partly they are at least a known quantity. And then I think if you're looking at, I should give one practical example. I was running a procurement, and it was about presenting what government was doing to the public. 3 companies came and pitched, and one of them led with an image of Whitehall, the street. And there was the what we would call Big Ben, the Tower of Westminster, Palace of Westminster, lit up, and the rest was greyed out. And what they hadn't realised was the bit we were interested in was the bit they had greyed out in their image, and the bit that was nothing to do with us was the bit that they had got in colour. And I have to say that influenced my decision to go, I don't want to spend my time as an official teaching them about how government works. They should go on a course. So I think it is a thing. Sometimes it's risk like that. It's going, can I work with these people? Do they know this world? And that makes it very difficult to break in. And I think that anyone in procurement would say, if your business hasn't already got that foot in the door, there are ways around that. So one of the things is you just have a go a couple of times, and people notice and go, they're serious, they're learning.
Yeah.
Use all the opportunities to have informal conversations, the rest of it. So often, yes, there are barriers and frustrations, but you can get past them.
Yeah.
And I suppose the other thing I might pick out, and this is more from being on the outside, trying to get contracts, if you like, from government, is partly it can be about mindset and social value. For example, if you are now trying to use to qualify, if you like, or to earn the points on that, can be extremely frustrating. Equally, it is in itself a good thing, and there's an extent to which you have to just not be too annoyed by some of the things that go on. And it's I always make say when you do the work, it is usually very, very rewarding in lots of ways. So it is worth pursuing it.
Well, hopefully, everything you've said there, hopefully these kind of webinars will help people to get that better sense of understanding of what government does and how Whitehall and Westminster work, so that you do have that kind of broad knowledge if you're going to try and get some work with government. But also, I just want to highlight, we are doing actually in GGF for the first time, I think, we're running a training seminar just on procurement, and that's going to be on Wednesday, the 11th of December. And just to say to everybody who's registered today and is listening today, we will send you details of that and send you a link to register for that one. So I think that will go into more detail about some of those issues that you, James, and Richard have mentioned about new ways for kind of even hearing about contracts that are up, and different ways to maybe help smaller businesses, for example, break through that. If you've never done it before, how do you get in and how do you become a kind of trusted supplier, and all those kind of issues I think will be covered in that training seminar on the 11th of December. So do look out for that. And we do have a question coming in. I really like this question because I think it's all about lessons learned, I think. And Ian Yates has said, how has or how will the post office and Fujitsu situation likely impact future government IT procurement processes? So I'd like to think there are lots of lessons learned exercises going on. Richard, you've got a small smile on your face. How do you think this will impact procurement going forward? I think you're on mute, Richard. I'm not sure
Am I back now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, because I think there will be a lot of sort of lessons learned from the ongoing inquiry. I am not au fait enough with it to know exactly what the post office thought it was buying when it bought the Horizon IT scheme. It seems fairly uncontested now that it did not deliver whatever it thought it was buying, and of course that had many downstream consequences for a lot of individuals. This again touches into some of the legal issues, and it's not something I've looked into super recently, but I think it is legally difficult, shall we say, for the government to bar companies from bidding for contracts. So I think Fujitsu will be able to continue to bid for government contracts should it wish to. There have been reports that it is currently kind of voluntarily not doing so. But and then it comes down to, again, a lot of this thing is informed by lawyers. How much in a procurement process can a unrelated department score Fujitsu's delivery in a case, or any supplier's delivery, to make it more general, based on work that it has not done for them. It will, if you are a department, you will have your own kind of analysis of contracts, and that's one thing I wanted to touch on briefly. Is Whitehall in its own procurement functions says that it is a lot better at the procurement process, the buying of the signing of the initial contract, than it is at the kind of ongoing monitoring of it and making sure that what has been purchased is actually delivered. That is where government is focusing a lot of its procurement reform efforts, is on that contract management side. So I think it will definitely be a factor that is taken into account, and there will be lessons from the public inquiry. But I don't think it can bar. It's very difficult legally to bar individual organisations, I think.
Some of that ongoing monitoring of a contract over its lifetime is actually being driven, I think, by the green agenda as well, isn't it? Because if you're claiming that you're going to be helping in the reduction of emissions, for example, that's going to have to be monitored over the course of that lifetime. So I think that might help with these other issues as well, indirectly. We do have another question coming in, James. So feel free if you want to add anything on what's already been said. But I like this question as well, because when I was doing some research yesterday on this, I wasn't sure about this myself. So Andre Hudvik has said UK procurement legislation used to be EU directive based. How much has changed after Brexit? From my quick Googling yesterday, I thought we were still complying with EU kind of legislation. But do you know anything different, James, on that? Have we changed anything post-Brexit?
So perhaps two things to say. I mean, one of which, obviously, the big change is, as a UK-based firm, you can't necessarily bid for work within the EU anymore, and so that's had a massive impact on some firms, and also particularly, for example, on consultancies, because there's now rules about how much you can deliver consultancy services in a remaining member state within the EU. So there's definitely that change in terms of the way the procurement operates in the rules base. No, my understanding is there's been no divergence of the system, but in a way, it's one of those areas where arguably it wouldn't make as much difference as it would in an area like product standards, where if the UK starts to diverge, it actually creates a potentially major problem for companies. But in the procurement field, if you're the procurement rules are going to be less of a worry if they do diverge in the future. And I think it's also one of the things where I suppose to sort of perhaps take some of the essence of that is sort of where is this all all going as well. And I think that's where you look at something like social value as an addition to the way that procurement has been perhaps seen in the past. That's something which is would always have been open to interpretation, not even at national level, but down to individual departments and individual bits of departments, individual agencies or arm's length bodies could just go, well, we put a different value on this. So, for example, there's the social value framework is enormous and has lots and lots of categories, and we see more and more that a body will just pick one and say, right, we do. We're interested in financial literacy, so our social value requirement from our contractors is that what are they doing to promote financial literacy? So they won't be asking on environment or social justice or economic development. They'll just be picking one of them and going, right, you do something really crunchy for us on this.
Yeah, thanks, James. Great question here from Andrea. And just to say, we've got about, I don't know, we haven't got that long left. So if you've got other questions, please do send them in before we have to wrap up. But Andrea has said that one problem with government is too many bodies are involved in one decision. So I think it's that lack of joining up. So government uses public money that has to be demonstrably put to good use. Everything has to be documented, checked legally and financially, but that's all done by different people who never see the entire system as one whole, which makes the process time consuming and annoying. So this is essentially about lack of joining up and the bureaucracy involved. And each part of that system, Andrew is saying, has to prove that it's not distorting the market in any way, and many more points. So I think it's more a comment from Andrea. Richard and James, I don't think you would disagree with that, would you, that there could be more streamlining of this process?
I think we would be in agreement on that. And perhaps just one thing to add before Richard comes in is I think another frustration for people making involved from the outside in the contracting and procurement process is that you often feel you know more about it than the people doing the procurement. And I think people are sometimes tempted to sort of want to engage with the department within the procurement process to sort of go, oh, I wouldn't do it like that. Oh, no, you should do this other thing. And unfortunately, it is very, very rare that that is an option. And so, again, it can be hugely frustrating. And I think whether right across the board, big infrastructure down to more mundane services, that thing of just go, I wouldn't start from here. I wouldn't do it like that. What if we had a 3-year contract, not a 2-year contract?
Yeah.
And that, I think, comes back to the more you can engage with the departments and agencies outside the formal procurement process, the easier it can be to try and see whether there's some scope for doing it differently.
I guess the flip side of that is what Richard said, is during COVID, we, ministers did try to kind of loosen some of the processes and the checks and balances in the system, and that can equally bring its own problems as we're seeing now with this current government trying to recoup some of the money that was spent and things weren't ever delivered. So I think it's getting that balance right, isn't it, between making sure all of the things are ticked and everything is done properly, but not kind of bogging the system down so that it becomes ridiculously slow.
Yeah, I think it's if you think of it as like a bell graph with the the volume of scrutiny on one
Yeah.
axis and the value of scrutiny on the other,
Yeah.
you're trying to get to the right point. The problem is you never quite know where you are on the graph to begin with.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of work done in government that did quicken delivery during COVID, not particularly related to the procurement point, but in the policy making field.
Yeah.
And I know government are trying to embed the lessons of that, but I know also in a lot of cases we're falling back somewhat to status quo ante. So yeah, it's a really good point, and getting the balance right is really difficult because you can't go 20,000 feet in the air and see where all the joins are.
Yeah. So in a moment, I'm going to give everyone listening their last chance to put any questions that you would like to Richard and James. But just to say, we have mentioned, I think, James, you've been in particular, the importance of understanding Whitehall and Westminster and how it works and everything if you're looking to do business with government. So I want to just run through a few opportunities that Global Government Forum can give you to do that. So on the screen here, we have, you see, so we've got multiple channels, I think, where we bring together public servants and private sector partners. So on there you can see, let me just take that down. We run lots of research that you can get involved with. We do training. I've mentioned already the particular training, but we show you some examples of other training that we do, but the particular training that we're going to be doing on procurement. We've got a website with great articles, lots of kind of articles from all around the world on innovation and things that are going on across civil services around the world. We do a podcast series on kind of transformation in government, leadership in government, where we interview inspirational kind of officials from around the world. We do webinars as well, where we bring together civil servants from different departments, from different countries, with specialists from the private sector as well. And we put on a series of summit in real life kind of summits and conferences. And I just want to mention a couple of those in particular that some people who are listening today might be interested in. So we've got coming up on the 19th of September, there's Public Service Data Live. This is the second year that we're going to be running this, hosted by the Cabinet Secretary and the Cabinet Office and ourselves, Global Government Forum, all about kind of data, digital, all things to do with how data and the use of data is transforming the way government runs, but also the way services are delivered. A really good opportunity for private sector partners to get alongside senior officials, especially some of the new officials maybe that have been brought in with the current government. So there's opportunities there. If you're interested, please do get in touch. I think we've got the Matt Hoare is head of our kind of commercial side. So we've got his details there, but we'll send you all of this. Don't worry, you will be sent all of this information. And then also I wanted to flag up, there's our kind of large annual innovation conference. Next year, it's going to be on the 25th and the 26th of March. We get thousands of civil servants through the door for this. All things innovation, cuts across all of the professions. And again, a really good opportunity to either showcase what you do or hear from kind of senior officials and potentially some ministers about what they're doing. And I think by March next year, there'll be a really good opportunity to see where the new government are taking the direction and a lot of the changes that they have put in place. So again, if you're interested in being part of that, please do get in touch with us. And then finally, I think I mentioned training already, but just to give you a sense, in addition to the training that we'll be doing on procurement, there's all a kind of sense of the other training offers that we do, everything from governance and strategy, regulation, project management, all those kind of issues. Again, if you're interested, or we can create bespoke training courses as well, please do get in touch with us. But before we wrap up, now is your chance. If you've got any questions about anything, any of those issues we've run through, the Civil Service Code, the Ministerial Code, regulation, procurement, any of those issues, I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So please do send them in now. While you're thinking about your final questions, I did have one that I wanted to put to James and Richard just from the very start, going back to that issue of civil service impartiality. That we mentioned, one of the 4 civil service values, because I used to get asked this a lot when I was a civil servant. Does that mean you cannot be a civil servant if you are, or in any way ever have been, party political? Does that rule you out from being a civil servant? James, come to you, and then Richard on that one.
It doesn't rule it out. So if you're a serving, and it partly depends what rank or level you are in the civil service. So the higher up, if you want to put it in those hierarchical terms, the more discreet you would have to be. But the sort of basic principle is you can sit in the back room putting leaflets in envelopes for a political party, but you can't go door knocking and take a public stance, and you certainly can't use your position as a civil servant to comment on the government.
Right.
That would be very, very impartial and would wreck the relationship between you doing your job as a civil servant and particularly the relationship with ministers. Does it have an effect? Yes. I mean, I think it's fair to say that it is much easier to be a civil servant if you do not have a political rosette pinned to your chest, and that's probably the right thing. It can be quite frustrating, but I think both before and during, and indeed after, it can be an issue, and that's why I think, again, and it's something we didn't touch on earlier, but both ministers and civil servants, when they leave those roles, they can't always just move straight into the next job. There is, potentially a cooling off period or suggestion, if you move from the Ministry of Defence to running a military contractor, that there should rightly be a bit of a pause so you don't use your knowledge of the inside workings of government. So that's one of the constraints from ethics and so on. But the same way, there's a little bit of that with what you might do as a civil servant. This isn't in any way trying to hint at anything in particular. It's just a general point that's been like that way for years.
Thanks. Richard, anything you wanted to add on impartiality? Can you, for example, have donated to a political party and be a civil servant?
So we have found out, due to some of the appointments that Labour has made under the exceptions rules that allow for short-term civil service appointments to be made, that in fact you can. It is a continuum, I think. James is right. I deal with many civil servants in this job, and I wouldn't know if they had political leanings or not. That is one of the key tenets, is that they leave that at the door. There was a case a couple of years ago that I remember covering where I think he was the head of trade statistics at the Office for National Statistics stood or decided to stand at election for the Brexit Party. There are other examples of this, and if you are standing for election, you have to leave immediately. That is
especially if you're standing for the Brexit Party.
Well, but there are examples as well of kind of civil servants who have gone on to political posts, and they leave immediately. That's one end of the continuum, as it were. It seems that the donating to a political party is not a immediate bar to a civil service job. There's some debate over whether the Treasury, when it appointed Ian Corfield to this short-term Director of Investment role in the Treasury, should have made the Commission, Civil Service Commission that we've mentioned, aware of that donation. But as far as we can tell, if they had done, it was not of a high enough, or the appointment was not of a high enough level that the Commission itself would have necessarily scrutinised it. Departments have an awful lot of trust from the Commission's point of view to kind of run these things themselves and to maintain their own trustworthiness. So yeah, I think it's one of those things that often comes up around changes of government when officials move in and out, and there's possibly more that can be done, but the fact we know about these exceptions one way or another means that they at least can be scrutinised.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It looks as if, I think, because we had lots of questions as we went through, if anyone does have a burning question, please do send it in now. But if not, I just want to, the very last thing that we are going to mention. So this, as we said, was the second of a series of 4 of how Whitehall and Westminster work webinars that we're doing. And our next one is going to be on the Friday, the 13th of September. And that one is going to focus all on operations, activity, and processes. So go into a bit more about the legislative process itself. So how is legislation passed through Parliament? And then delivery. So how do you get from policy out through to delivery? So how do you take those policy ideas and actually make sure they are delivered into real action on the ground? We're going to be looking at how Brexit has affected government delivery. James, you touched on that maybe in some of the things that we could now see changes now that we've been out for a few years, and then how to achieve real world outcomes through policy delivery. So going from development of policy right through to implementation, and maybe picking up on some of Richard's points about how is that then monitored as well over time to make sure that policy is having impact. If you are interested in that third webinar, again, it's building up your bank of knowledge of how all of these things work. You will see that a link has just been sent out, so please do register. Again, it's free to attend that one. So we hope to see you on that one. And then our final one, Richard, I think, which will be a few weeks after that, will be around looking at maybe some of the changes. I think that's right, isn't it? Post the new government coming in. I think that's the one we are going to end on.
Yes, indeed.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for your great questions throughout that conversation. Really enjoyed that discussion. I always learn a lot as well throughout these conversations. Hope to see you on our next one. Please do register for the next couple and also for that training webinar you'll get on procurement when we send you the details for that. Finally, thanks again to James and Richard for being such great experts today. And I look forward to seeing you on our next conversation. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day. Cheers. Bye-bye.